Hello and welcome to the 2025 Small Ruminant Webinar Series. I'm your host, Carolyn Edie, the Small Ruminant Outreach Specialist for UW-Madison Division of Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And tonight, our guest speaker is Dr. Garland Dahlke from Iowa State University, and I'm going to give him the stage by stop sharing my screen. If you guys have any questions tonight, go ahead and put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that as Dr. Dahlke will be speaking, and then also we'll open up the mics after the presentation if you have any questions you'd like to ask him. And we'll all get started.
Right. Well, I'm Garland Dahlke. I guess a research scientist at Iowa State University. I'm with the Beef Center, but that don't let it disappoint you. Beef Center here at Iowa State is pretty much all ruminant nutrition, and we do a lot of beef stuff, of course, but I also do quite a bit of small ruminant stuff, from white-tailed deer to sheep and goats, llamas, alpacas, buffalo, you name it, we get it. And what we're going to be looking at tonight is this past summer and kind of dealing with what the weather dealt out in terms regarding forages, because there were some struggles, especially as you go north and east of Ames, Iowa. And so we'll dive right in. So I guess for an example, I looked at Marshfield, Wisconsin. There's the research farm there, University of Wisconsin Research Farm at Marshfield, and they had some challenges. So normal precipitation in Marshfield is usually 32 to 33 inches of precipitation per year. In 2024, there was about 41.39 inches, which is about 27% more than normal, which is, sizable. But I guess what made it um, hard, difficult was they had 32.9 inches that fell between April and September. And, it was a 6-month span. It's the growing season, which normally you need some rain then, but it's a heavy soil, and they got all the rain they normally get during that time, plus. And so it really made some challenges to make decent dry forage this summer, and even haylage if you're looking to do something like that. And when you got wet weather, just harvesting forage is very difficult. Making dry hay is pretty much impossible. You get a lot of heating, as my big bales show here. You get mold, and whatever it is, they all cause a nutrient loss, and that's really the first thing to deal with. And our hay really is a big bank of nutrients for our livestock. And, when we start having situations like this heating here, we're going to be losing a considerable amount of nutrients. Now, the mold part is what I'm going to get into first, and the mycotoxins, because that's usually the thing that gets most people concerned and worked up, and rightly so. I mean, there's some issues there. Um, like say the mycotoxins are secondary metabolites of the molds that are growing, and they're often toxic to mammals, not always, but a lot of times they are. So it's something to be concerned about. Um, there are about 400 different mycotoxins out there, and there's new ones still being discovered every day. There's quite a bit of stuff here. Usually we don't worry about all 400. There is a place in Austria, and I've worked with them a little bit on some issues with corn silage, and they have almost all 400, in terms of samples to work with there, and it's kind of interesting. But really, we work with about 12 of them routinely in the United States, and this is mainly because we have regulations with these, and we know a lot about them. The other ones, they may not be real dangerous, or we just don't know much about them, so we don't worry quite as much about them, but they are there, and they can do a lot of different things. For anything from, causing immediate death to cancer to fatty livers. They can even take the pigmentation out of your skin. If you have black, dark skin, they can make it bleached out, take away that. So, I mean, mycotoxins can do a lot of different things, and we really haven't harnessed all their capabilities or realize all their dangers. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, there's a variety of compounds here, and there's a variety of effects, as I kind of alluded to. And I just brought up Aspergillus species of fungus here, just as an example. Now, Aspergillus, a lot of times if you've heard of farmer's lung, this is one of the culprits behind it. There's a few other organisms, but Aspergillus is one of the biggies. And the Aspergillus species of fungi, they bring on your aflatoxins, and those cause, fatty livers, liver cancer, birth defects, a lot of bad things. There's some other Aspergillus species that'll bring on ochratoxin A, for an example, and that's one that'll really do a lot of kidney damage. And actually, like the ochratoxin A, that's something that's often found in coffee beans. So that's one of the things they screen for in coffee beans if you're a coffee drinker. Aflatoxin, we always think of that in corn and grain, but it there's different ones for different plants, okay? And then like the final one here, gliotoxin, this is one that'll cause nerve damage and kind of make you feel stupid because it literally will block some of the neurotransmissions. So there's, say, a lot of different ones. This is just uh, one of the species and then within the family, and there's a lot more. And I say in a wet year, like aflatoxin is really not a big problem. That's usually a drought, a high heat summer type of deal. And then usually you'll see aflatoxin. In a wet summer, like central Wisconsin experience, generally there you'll see fumonisin and the the DON types or vomitoxins and stuff of that nature. And I guess the thing is, a lot of times we talk about these in grains or like coffee beans for my ochratoxin, but it really is an issue in forages as well. And the thing is, the forages usually don't get as much attention as the grain does because the grain gets fed to people, pigs, chickens, and they're a lot more sensitive than what ruminants would be in many cases. But before I came to Iowa State 30 years ago or whatever it was, I was a nutritionist in central Wisconsin. That's why I picked Marshfield as my example to start it out. And it was usually in our forages that we had the highest concentrations of these mycotoxins. And so it's just something to be aware of. I say a lot of times we don't think about it in forages, but they really can be a problem. So the other thing that I bring up here at the end is, even if a mycotoxin is not present, just the dust that these molds create can be kind of a problem for respiratory disease, allergies, fevers. So if we got a lot of hay that's was made a little bit tough and we get a lot of mold in there, we may not have a mycotoxin, but it is dusty. And horse owners are pretty sensitive to this because horses get the dust and their lungs get the heaves. Sheep and cattle are the same. Not they're a lot more tolerant to the dust, but a lot of these things can still happen, and we just need to be aware of it. I guess, as although the mycotoxins can be produced by mold and storage, most commonly it occurs. The biggest problem is usually out in the field before we ever harvest the plant, and so that's just something to be aware of because a lot of times we don't even think about it until we see mold, but a lot of it is really based on the year. And so like a wet year, you know, stuff like vomitoxin may be growing out there and we don't even know about it. So just something to be aware of. And I guess the other thing that's adding to this is, we do a lot of no-till um, plants, growing agronomy these days. Years ago when we moldboard plowed, we usually buried a lot of the trash and a lot of the mold that infects the growing plant is in the trash. So we do need to be aware of that. The other thing is when we spread manure on like a hay field, we can really inoculate it with some molds and then we can have some issues too. So it's not advocating giving up no-till farming and all that, but it's just something to be aware of. And I guess a good example would be if we look at vegetable crops, which are a lot less tolerant of molds, in the Central Sands area, for instance, of Wisconsin, they moldboard plow everything because the plants just can't take the exposure to the molds that are growing there. Where we've bred corn and soybeans, alfalfa to be somewhat tolerant to that, and grow through it without a problem. So just be aware of that. The next issue I want to bring up with these mycotoxins is there's really no single fix in terms of an additive that we can just feed the animal and the problem will go away. Um, Aflatoxin usually gets the most press because we do know of its dangers and it is, it's out there, especially in dry, warm years. So something like bentonite clay is maybe used for that, and then there's some other yeast cell wall products and stuff. But a lot of those things won't work on like vomitoxin. And so then we may have to use another product for that. So like Biomin, they have a product that's an enzyme, and that does work on vomitoxin to some degree, but less effective on aflatoxin. So depending on what mold or mycotoxin we're dealing with, we may have to look into different things if we want to be effective. So just something to be aware of there. There's just not one fix for all. And the other thing is if you do find one mycotoxin, there's probably a number of others as well. It's usually not just a single problem. You may have a series of mycotoxins in that plant, different molds, different mycotoxins. So just something to be aware of there. And then my final point on this slide is that mycotoxins have an additive effect. So one mycotoxin above a threshold may be bad and you don't want to feed that. But you could have three mycotoxins there at sub-threshold levels that could be just as bad or worse than just having that one above a threshold. So just be aware that they do have an additive effect and can cause some trouble that way. So what to do about it if you do have something? With a ruminant, there is one defense mechanism that they have, and that's the protozoa within their rumen. They're kind of a natural anti-mycotoxin formula there, and they literally eat the mycotoxin. So it's kind of a nice feature. It's maybe not 100% effective, but it does reduce the effects, and that's why sheep and cattle generally have a little higher tolerance than what pigs or chickens would to a mycotoxin or human being. Here's some pictures of some of the protozoa within the rumen. There's quite a few of them, and I say these are all commonly found within the rumen. And you see they're about 50 micrometers in size. Okay, and compared to a bacteria, they're about quite a bit bigger. Bacteria maybe 1 to 10 microns, or these would be 1 to generally 50 or more. There's actually some that are actually centimeters in length, but those are stuff you find in the water, deep sea kind of thing. But in the rumen, these here that are around 50 microns in size are kind of common. I say considerably bigger than a bacteria. So I say protozoa are a class of organisms. So there's a lot of different species within that class, so just to be aware of, and that's why there's a lot of different sizes. Say they consume mycotoxins and will remove them from the animal's GI tract. They are pH sensitive and ionophore sensitive. So therefore, if you have a mycotoxin problem and you're doing all you can, the other things you want to do is maintain a higher level rumen pH. So that usually means feeding less starch and sugars within the diet to keep the rumen pH a little higher, 6 or above. And we probably would not want to have Bovatec or Rumensin in a diet where we have a mycotoxin problem. And I say if you pull those ionophores out of their diet, usually it does help the animal with it a little bit more. Dilution is also a nice solution for this. If you can kind of dilute it with other feeds so they don't have to get quite as big a dose. So I bring up the mycotoxin thing first because that's always an issue when you have hay that gets tough and you make it and it gets moldy, and then what do you got to do with it? I say the mold may or may not have a mycotoxin in. And I say most of the time the mycotoxin was growing before you ever harvested that feed. So there's something to be aware of. Now, the other big, big thing I want to talk about is really the hay quality itself. So the mycotoxins, they actually consume nutrients and they will reduce the quality of the feed in themselves. And then the other thing is just the weather exposure or the delay in harvest. And so this year, I had a couple good examples here. The bale on the left would have been made down here in Ames. We had almost a perfect year. We had enough rain. A lot of times we're always on the little on the dry side, but this year we had enough rain and we had nice harvest windows, so we were able to make hay on time. So the big bale there, it was May 28th, turned out nice. And we had a situation up north where I'm from, my family. We had some hay that they just couldn't make it. They were just north of Marshfield a little bit, and that's why I was kind of sensitive to their weather. And they were delayed about 4 weeks in making their first crop hay. And so they didn't get the first crop made till June 24th, and they just snuck it off, literally. They in between showers, and it was a little tough, and it got rained on a little bit, and then it kind of dried out a little. So they put a lot of acid on, baled it up. And then finally, they had some fields they couldn't get on at all. The land was too low and it was too heavy of soil, so they just couldn't drive on it, and they couldn't make the hay until September 8th. So they had first crop all with first, second, third, fourth, all in one in September, one big cutting, and compared to making it early and forcing it off, and versus an ideal or more ideal year. And I guess the first thing I want to point out here is in December, I took forage samples of these feeds, and the hay that was made early, that was 89% dry matter. Okay, it was inside dry, no problem. The hay that was made a month later and was tough, that we put a bunch of acid on just to kind of get it off, that was still 69% dry matter. There's still a lot of moisture in that feed. And I guess that's something to be aware of when you do put acid on hay and you put it in a building or keep it, covered up and don't try and force dry it. The moisture really doesn't go away. And so you just kind of need to be aware of that, especially when you start feeding it later. And then finally, the hay that was made in September, what that was it was nice and dry. The field dried out finally, and they would make it, and it was 90% dry matter when I sampled it in December. So it's just something to be aware of that moisture doesn't usually want to leave a bale. And I say that can be a problem. And these were all big bales. Smaller bales do dry out a little bit better sometimes, but just they don't dry out completely. So we'll look at the quality changes or differences between these hays. So these are the same hay. And looking at just crude protein. So the stuff that was made on time was about 18% crude protein. The solubility of that protein was about 26.77. So 26% of that crude protein would be considered soluble protein or soluble in water. The adjusted crude protein, and this would take into account the protein as the fiber is growing and the protein's there, the fiber will sometimes bind that protein and make it unavailable to the animal. And so for that stuff that was made early, and it was a fairly warm, dry time when we harvested it, so it was about 17.3% crude protein based on with that adjustment for that fiber, or it was still about 96% available. Okay. Now the hay that was made a month later because it was just too wet to get it made on time, that it dropped from 18 to 19.58. Okay, so that wasn't so nice. The solubility of that dropped quite a bit too, went to 8.89. Now, usually you can expect that as hay matures, the soluble crude protein will disappear. It'll get bound up in the fiber and things change and it just isn't as soluble. But one of the things that does happen with this hay, because this sample was a little bit on the tough side or wet side, is that solubility of this protein really was mostly a urea type of protein. Because what happened is you had dissociation of the protein, the amino acids into urea and some of the building blocks. So the soluble protein in this situation where this delay happened had a considerable amount of urea, where that other soluble protein in that hay that was made on time under good conditions was still a lot of true protein. It just was soluble and just something to be aware of. Now, the adjusted crude protein of this hay that was delayed was made at 8.45% crude protein. So when you're feeding the animal, that's the protein you want to be looking at. But so it was about 88% available. Okay, so being that it was a cool, wet month, it wasn't as bad as what it could have been. If it would have been 100 degrees every day, that adjusted crude protein value would have dropped quite a bit more. and the availability probably would be more in the 70s instead of the 80s. Now, the final hay that was finally made in September, where we just couldn't get on the field, even though it's the same, was essentially the same type of hay. It was kind of a clover, orchard grass, Timothy mix. That protein dropped to 8.61, which is a little lower, and you'd expect that, but it really wasn't probably as bad as what you would think it would be. And mainly that's because you start getting a lot of regrowth coming through because you got second crop, third crop, whatever coming as well. And so when you cut this, you have all the dead stuff from the first crop, but then you have these other crops coming through. And so the first crop that was all dead and more like straw does dilute it down, but it's not as bad as what you may anticipate it to be. The solubility of that was considerably lower, and you'd expect that from the maturity. But the thing that happened is because this hay was made nice and dry, we don't have a lot of urea being released into this, so that soluble number is actually less than what you see with the number that was after 1 month delayed. And that's what's kind of going on there. The adjusted crude protein in this was with 7.83%, and overall it's still 91% available. So it actually looks a little better in that regard when you compare it to the stuff that was made or kind of forced off in June. A couple things here that happen, or you maybe know already. Crude protein will decrease with maturity, and you can see that happening here. The fiber plus the heat or the maturity will bind the existing proteins to some degree, making it unavailable. And you see that happen, especially as you go from, the stuff made in May versus June. You start to see that happen a little bit. If it would have been a hotter year, it would have been a lot worse. Wetter hay and younger hay tend towards a higher soluble or solubility fraction. Rained on hay will have lower solubility values if you let it dry out again, because a lot of the soluble protein gets lost. So that's one of the things that happens. And then wet hay tends to have a measurable ammonia level and decreased amino acid or true protein content. So just some things to be aware of there. Okay. We look at fiber, and fiber is kind of a wild card because fiber can be very digestible or it can be very undigestible depending on the year and the conditions that the forage is grown in. So this first sample, which is down here in Ames, the NDF of that was 35.96%. And you can see as we delay harvest to about a month later, shoots up to about 59.91 from this stuff up north. And then keeping that same hay, but not being able to harvest it till September because the field and the conditions wouldn't allow us to. We really didn't change that a whole lot. It still stayed about 59.86. And I say a lot of that may be due to younger plants growing up into it, but it kind of plateaus at that point. The next number here would be the total track NDFD of percent of the NDF. So it's digestibility is really what it is. They use this number in dairy cows, but it does apply to our sheep and goats. You can see the stuff that was made where it was warm and dry, it was about 34.9% digestible. The stuff that was delayed was 27.01, and then the stuff that was delayed until September actually started to go back up. It was 28.63. And so that drop from late May to June is expected because that plant is maturing so much. But then at the end, you start seeing it get better because you have young growth starting to take into it again. Now, if we would have had a wet, cool spring, this total track NDFD value could be as high as 50, 60%. But because it did start getting kind of warm, that digestibility went away fast. The next number is the undigestible NDF after 240 hours of incubation time. And this essentially tells us what is completely undigestible. You might as well eat plastic for the most part, is kind of what it's telling you. And that stuff that was made early was 22% of that fiber was completely undigestible. Where if we waited a month, you can see it shoots up to 34. And then as we go into September, it kind of starts to dip back down to 30%. Then the next number would be the percent lignin, which is pretty much directly proportional to the undigestible NDF. You can see how that changes over time. And you can see here in the end where the cool weather is starting to move in, it really comes, it's fairly low again. And they say that's really a big deal when it comes to fiber. And that's what makes it such a kind of a wild card in terms of what's going to happen. So just to kind of summarize it, the fiber will increase with maturity. Fiber plus heat or heat plus maturity will reduce the digestibility and therefore the energy value of that feed. Reduces the protein digestibility because as that fiber becomes less digestible, it binds the protein, making it less digestible. And it can modify mineral availability. So sometimes as you increase fiber indigestibility, that some of these minerals also get bound up and become less digestible. Others are not so much that way. And so minerals are kind of each mineral is a little different based on what you're dealing with. But generally, as you have higher digestible fiber, you have a little better mineral availability, but not always. Some of these other energy components, so the non-fiber carbohydrate percent or NFC, you can see that the stuff that's made on time when it should be was close to 30%, 29.57. You start delaying that, you can see it drops quite a bit. And if you delay it till September and wait till good weather, it actually gets up pretty good again. Now, that stuff that was delayed did have a little shower of, rain fell on it at maybe a quarter inch. And you can see the devastation that does. It really leaches out those non-fiber carbohydrates. And that's really a kind of a key component of high quality forage. You can quickly tell if you got good feed or not by looking at that NFC number. If it's been rained on, it's going to drop into the teens really quickly. It should be in the high 20s. And they say if it dries too slow or if it gets a shower, it's going to drop fast. And you can kind of see what happened with that hay that was made a month late. The NSC or non-structural carbohydrates, looking at the sugar component of that, you can see what that is. It starts out around 9, almost 10% in that hay that was made on time. And because of the hay that was made a month later and got a little bit of shower on it, cut it right in half immediately because sugars are very soluble in water, as you know, they melt in your mouth kind of thing. And then looking at the end here, cool weather and good weather conditions to make hay, it's almost back to where it would have been with hay that was made on time early. The starch component, you can see that's usually about half of what the sugar would be. And you can kind of see how that transpires. It's around 4 in the hay that's made when it should have been. It was about 3. You can see it's a little, not quite as soluble as sugar, so you don't lose it quite as bad. So just something to be aware of there. And you can see that also kind of starts going up again in the fall when you have good weather to make hay. The fat content you can see stays pretty consistent across the board. So it's just something to be aware of there. And really what's the thing that you're losing and you really don't want to lose is that non-fiber carbohydrate. And the non-structural carbohydrates, sugar and starch, are a good component or large component of the NFC. So I say that's just part of it. So as kind of a summary here, the non-fiber carbohydrate is the biggest contributor to energy and will decline with age of the plant. And fiber and mineral components will increase in the plant as this happens, and exposure to rain will wash it out quickly. Starch tends to increase over time as the plant matures, replacing the sugar, and higher temperatures or maturity will accelerate that. And the fermentation products may also result, and they're another energy component of this that we haven't got into yet, but that is something to be aware of. And in our next slide here, that hay that was delayed a month and was made kind of tough, I say it was about 69% dry matter instead of 80 plus, 90 plus. You can see it started to ferment. There was the pH, there was no change in pH, with the stuff made on time. No lactic, acetic, or butyric acid found there. But that stuff that was made a little tough, even though we put a bunch of acid, propionic acid on it, it still started to ferment. And it's very difficult to get enough acid on to really arrest that fermentation in these bales. And that's why they heat and can cause a barn fire if you're not careful. The acid does slow that down, but it's hard to get enough acid on to do that. Um, Kind of to summarize this, acid treated bales really do not dry out once they are in storage if you put them in a building, and it's difficult and expensive to get enough acid on the bales to arrest all the microbial activity. Sugar and starch are the primary drivers of this fermentation. And the other thing is that can happen when you have these sort of fermentations like this, you have the risk of creating bioamines, and they can produce some bad things. And you can look at just the pH of that hay that was delayed a month. Normally, when you make decent haylage or corn silage, you're going to have a pH around 4 or less. And here you can see the pH is about 5.49. And so this starts to get a little bit dangerous because this is where you start getting listeria growing. It's kind of a good environment. It's a little bit moist. The pH isn't too low that it kills off the listeria, and you can start to have some issues with this. So it's really something to be aware of when you're dealing with tough hay. It would have been better just to make it wet and put it in a bag or something, seal it up to avoid the problem. But in this case, it's kind of in the danger zone for some of those other things that we don't want to see. Looking at these three hay samples, and here's how the energy pans out. So the decent hay that was made, you can see the net energy for maintenance was 0.55 megacalories per pound of dry matter. The NEG is 0.30. Okay, so it's not too bad. This hay that was delayed a month, the energy is almost cut in half in terms of net energy for maintenance. You can see it goes to zero point 0.3. The NEG component really drops. Okay. And then as you look at the hay that was delayed until September, the energy is really not a whole lot better, but it is a little bit better than that stuff that was made in June, a month later than the stuff that should have been made. So what this means in terms of the ration. So let's look at our second trimester U as a starting example. If we look at the hay that was made on time, the good hay, the table here is telling us that they can eat about 6.5 pounds of this hay. And on a dry basis, that would be 5.8 pounds of dry matter. Okay. And if we look at then at the energy being supplied, it'd be 114% of their energy requirement. So this would be the maintain DU plus add any body condition that she may need and the developing fetal lambs that are growing inside of her. So she's got more than enough energy here. So this is kind of a big positive time. The MP or metabolizable protein requirement is 200% of the requirement being met. So they got double what they need at this point. And as far as dry matter intake ratio, that's at 100%. Now, in reality, we don't need to feed, if our ewes are in good shape, we don't need to be overfeeding them. So we actually can limit these ewes down to 5.7 pounds of hay instead of 6.5. And that would give us 100% of our energy being required. We still have more than enough protein, and we'd be actually limit feeding these ewes to be about 86% of what their capacity would be. So just that's kind of what we're dealing with there. If we take the hay that was rained on and made a month later, just kind of snuck it off the field, we'd be feeding about 4.8 pounds of feed and about 3.3 pounds of dry matter. Now, what's going on here is the fiber content of that hay that was made later is so high that that's causing the sheep to feel full. They just can't fill themselves full any fuller. And that's all they can eat because of their capacity. The problem with that is it's only satisfying 37% of their net energy requirement and 86% of their metabolizable protein requirement. And that's at 100% of their intake in terms of all they can eat. So we have a problem starting here. Okay, and that can maybe sneak up and bite us later. If we take that hay that was delayed until September before it's made, we have a similar situation. The dry matter of that hay is quite a bit higher, so 3.7 pounds of hay or 3.3 pounds of dry matter. Okay, it's the 4.8 and the 3.7 are the same amounts of dry matter in these two. The energy requirement is only 42% of that's being met. So we had a little higher energy because we had a little higher NFC value of that feed. The MP requirement is a little lower because we were a point lower in crude protein. And so only 84% of their metabolizable protein is being met at 100% intake. So that means we got to start looking at formulating a ration to take care of those issues. And right below it, you can kind of see how that looks. So with the good hay, we don't need to add any corn or any distillers. The hay's more than adequate. With the hay that's been rained on, it's going to take about 1.85 pounds of corn plus the hay to make that ration work. As we do add that corn, you can see the 1.85 pounds of corn, which is quite a bit of corn, does make the ration a little more digestible. So instead of 4.8 pounds of hay, they can actually eat a little bit more, 4.9. Not a big difference, but it does happen. So when we deal with a ruminant animal, the intake isn't static. It's going to change based on the digestibility of that diet. And here's an example of that happening. The hay that was delayed until September before it was made is similar. We got to add some energy. Here, 1.6 pounds of corn will do it. We don't have to add quite as much because we do have a little bit more energy in that hay. And as far as the hay being fed with that corn, it'd be about 3.8. And they say the corn does make that a little more digestible. And so they can eat a touch more feed than what they would be just on straight hay. As that was the second trimester, and that's usually pretty easy sailing for the most part. The third trimester gets a little more hairy, and when we start dealing with ewes that are carrying triplets, twins probably for sure most of the time, triplets or quads, we really start running into some issues because the fetal lambs have a big requirement, and if we're dealing with goats, same deal. But the capacity of the ewe is kind of set. They get a big belly, but their rumen is actually getting squished down, so the capacity is decreasing. So looking at the good hay first, so we these guys can eat about 5.6 pounds of the raw hay that's good quality, or 5 pounds of dry matter. So it's starting to shrink them down a little bit. This covers 96% of their energy requirement, and their protein requirement only 125%. So they still got enough protein, but energy is starting to now take its toll a little bit. If we go to the rained on hay or the stuff made in June, it's a lot worse because they can only eat 4.1 pounds of that hay or 2.8 pounds of dry matter. So only 31% of their energy requirements being met and 52% of their metabolizable protein from just the hay alone. And the stuff made in September, you can see a similar pattern there, 34% of the energy and 51% of the protein. So we have to supplement those diets. So with the good hay, it takes just a dab of corn to make it work. Rained on hay, we got all the corn we had before. Plus, we have to add some distillers because we got to take care of this protein requirement. It's not being met. If we deal then with the stuff delayed until September, we have a similar situation. We need the corn and we need quite a bit of distillers to make things work out, just to balance it. So it gets a little more tricky. And we're starting to feed quite a bit of grain, which some sheep can take it and some sheep can't. So it's just something to be aware of. Early lactation. So one thing about lactation is it increases the appetite considerably in a ewe or a doe. And so the good hay, those ewes could put down about 7.9 pounds of that good hay or 7 pounds of dry matter. And this is going to cover about 78% of their energy requirement and about 101% of their protein requirement. So their protein is just being met for all practical purposes, and they just need some energy. The rained on hay, you can see we're still in trouble, 25%. They're eating quite a bit more dry matter, but it's still limiting how much they can eat because of all the fiber and undigestible fiber. So you can see 25% of the energy being met, 36% of the protein, and the stuff made later, it's similar in 28 and 33. So when it comes to supplementation here, just a little bit of corn plus the good hay, they're set to go. You don't have to worry about much purchase feeds. If you grow corn and hay, you're set. The stuff that's been rained on, you can see we're supplementing quite a bit of feed here, a little over 4 pounds of feed of supplement. And then the hay is about 5 pounds that they're getting of the raw hay. And they say it's sort of wet. That's why it's 5 pounds. Where the stuff delayed until September, it's a similar amount of supplementation. We're using a little more distillers than corn, and then the hay at 3.85. So we're actually feeding, a higher proportion of grain than we are hay in those situations, just to balance the diet. So regarding the lactating youth, something that's kind of subtle and creeping up on us is with that higher NDFD or NDF digestibility of the good hay, we're getting about 0.89 pounds of digestible NDF into the U. And with the lower quality hay, it's about 0.65. It's just something to start looking at. Now, we look at physically effective NDF or the chewable fiber. You can see there's a little difference there because we don't have to put as much grain in, 27 versus 23. If we look at the non-structural carbohydrate, we can get by feeding a lower amount of starch and sugar with that high quality hay versus the stuff, the lower quality hay, 23 versus 31. Now that's all fine, but really what's starting to happen is you're starting to influence milk components. So the higher quality hay is going to create a milk that has higher milk fat. And our little ewes or lambs, they're going to want about 10% fat in their milk. And we're going to start causing that to go down. Where we start feeding this lower quality hay and we got all this extra grain going in, we're not going to see the butter fat is high in that feed. So just something to be aware of. And I say that it can impact performance of those little lambs. So just be aware of that. Now, if we look at that ration with using the poor quality hay, you can see on a percentage basis, it's about 46% hay, 31% corn, 22% distillers. And so the ration calculates out about 13% protein, 38% NDF, 36.3% NFC, 29.3% NSC or non-structural carbohydrate, and digestible NDF is about 47%. And I guess what I'm challenging you here is when you do have these poor quality hays, you may want to consider using something like a digestible fiber source like soy hulls. So here I have the same poor hay, but by using a lot of soy hulls in this diet, I'm able to reduce my corn from 31% to 8% of the diet. And my distillers is about the same. It's about 22 and 26. So it makes kind of a difference because then when you look at your ration, the crude protein is a little higher, and a lot of that's because we don't have as much bypass protein, but that's okay. The NDF is higher in this alternative ration, but as you look down where it goes NDFD, instead of 47% digestible, we're at 64.8% digestible. So we're getting a lot of energy from that fiber. And by doing this, we're also able to keep the butter fat up within the milk and hopefully get a little better lamb performance, healthier lambs. Because say little lambs do have a high requirement for milk fat, and just something to be aware of. And it's one of the little things that we just careless supplementation can lead to some trouble. So to wrap things up here, forage energy is the first nutrient to be compromised due to leaching of sugars and reduced fiber digestibility when we have weather that causes us having to have trouble making forage or harvested forage. And really, we should consider using some digestible fiber sources to maintain existing forage fiber digestibility and also reduce the adverse effects of excessive free starch and sugar entering the rumen. Okay, and I talked about milk fat, but we also can start dealing with ulcers, whether it be rumen ulcers or abomasal ulcers, and that then can be a problem. And also overeating disease starts to creep in here as well, because when these ewes, even though it's mostly a lamb problem, it can crop up these ewes as well because they're eating a lot of feed, and as we get a lot of starch not being completely digested in the rumen and it gets downstream, it's where we can have some Clostridium issues pop up. And finally, forage protein will be reduced and a large percent will become unavailable because of the weather issues like we dealt with. So we always got to keep that in mind as we were balancing our protein. So it's question time, and I'll turn it back to the boss here, and she can ask me questions. So Carolyn, it's all yours.
Great, Garland. Thank you so much. I think a lot of times as sheep and goat producers, we're always told, oh, save your best hay to, late gestation and lactation and feed whatever you have. But you demonstrated that whatever you have still might not be good enough. So
Yeah.
thank you for those examples and ways to mitigate those different types of feeding strategies. And yeah, that's something in Iowa. We just feed corn. I think it's really common just to supplement corn, but thinking about what other types of products you could feed to help increase their nutrition is really interesting. So I haven't had any questions from the chat. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to open their mics up and ask Dr. Dahlke? Have a
Is
quiet
there
bunch.
any benefit to other grains like rye or barley over corn in terms of digestibility or tolerance for those sheep that don't tolerate grain as well?
Well, yeah, I guess the thing, corn does have one benefit is it's a little more slowly digestible, in terms of like rumen acidosis.
Mm-hmm.
Barley and rye tend to be a little more speedy. They do have some fiber usually coming in with them. So there is something there as far as the energy component, it's about the same energy, corn, rye, barley. So I guess you still got to be a little bit careful there, and you can still reduce milk fat for one right
Mm-hmm.
away. And but I guess, some of the Clostridium problems may not be there because it is faster in terms of digestibility in the rumen. So a lot of times what happens with corn is like a young ewe that's really milking hard, she may eat 5 to 7% of her body weight as dry matter, which is quite a bit. And a lot of times it just doesn't have time to digest. It gets in the intestines and you have a problem in terms of like Clostridium. So rye and barley tend to digest a lot faster. And so you wouldn't probably have that as easy, but you could have more acidosis problems and the decreased milk fat. So I guess something to consider, I brought up soy hulls because they're pretty common here in Iowa and they're very digestible. It's almost about 85% of the energy value of corn. Our friends up in North Dakota, they have beet pulp. It works really well. It's even maybe better in some cases. We also have corn gluten feed. Eastern Iowa is kind of a corn gluten feed mecca, and that also works very well and it should be considered in situations like this. So just there's other things out there.
Well, thank you.
And I have found when feeding distillers, or it might take them a day or two to realize what that is, but they don't balk at the bunk at all once they get used to some of these other things. They're quite good at eating them, so it's good.
They are. They do. I notice you can spoil, I think, sheep more than and goats more than other animals. When they get like molasses, they like the sweetness of that, and it's kind of sometimes hard to go from molasses to like a distiller's product because distillers, it has a little sulfur in and I doesn't taste quite as well. And sheep are touchy with taste. Goats are even more so. So there can be some transition issues. And but generally, if they're not spoiled too bad, you can feed them a lot of different things and they'll get used to it and gobble it right up. So just to be aware of.
So, a simple forage test, you can get those to test for molds and mycotoxins as well. Is that where you find out what you would have if you were concerned about molds and mycotoxins?
Yeah, that's really a good place to start. So like Dairyland Labs, Rock River Labs, they both offer a nice mycotoxin package. And they look at the most common ones, just maybe about 6 to 8 of them that they look at. It's a little more expensive than the regular forage tests. Your regular forage test, you'd probably be about $33. And when you do the mold and mycotoxins, it's usually closer to 100. But if you're worried, it can give you some peace of mind if you know you have it or don't have it, and you can kind of deal with it. Usually, though, like I say, there's a lot of different mycotoxins out there. And they look at just the most common. And if you have the most common showing up, you probably got some other ones going on. And I say there's some that even haven't been identified yet. And I guess just as an example to be aware of, in eastern Iowa, there 3 times now we've run into this in corn. It's in corn silage, but it has a lot of properties similar to oh like pesticide poisoning, and it affects the brain cholinesterase. And what it ends up is the animals, like when the lambs are born, they'll have tremors and convulsions, and you just won't recover, or they don't know enough to get up and nurse. And 3 times now we've had this happen. We have not identified what the causative agent is, but it has been in corn silage. And the diagnostic lab here at Iowa State dealt with the brains of all these animals, and they all had the same situation where they have zero cholinesterase left, and they just don't react well. And older animals, it got to be that they would drink it and they'd eat the feed, and they wouldn't know enough to get up and drink when it got to be summertime, so they would die of dehydration just laying next to a water tank. So it was really frustrating. And so I'd say there's things out there that we don't really even know about what they are, other than all of a sudden we have some dead animals and it's a bad surprise. But so it's just something to be aware of, and so just to be aware of, I guess, point it out.
Do you have any thoughts on the molasses licks as a supplement percentage or anything like that, similar to grain feeding during lactation and so forth?
Yeah, I guess they're convenient, and it's one way to get minerals into them. I guess I wouldn't really count on them for protein and energy supplementation though, because you just to think of the pounds that you need, it gets expensive for one thing. But so I guess some animals will overdose, some won't like it at all. Most of them like it. It tastes good. But I guess I'd be a little bit cautious there. The other thing is when they do use them to provide protein, you get a lot of urea type proteins in those tubs for the most part. And as you get closer to parturition, you really don't want urea in that diet anymore. It tends to do a number of things. One is just blood pH is just so slightly modified, and that's usually enough to cause a milk fever. And we really don't want that to happen, and it does. So that's something to be aware of. Sometimes there's some other issues that can pop up, but I guess the first one that's going to happen will be milk fever. And usually, whenever you got urea in a diet within the first, or say 3 weeks from lambing or kidding on, you could have some trouble. Once they've had their babies and they're lactating, you could use it, but it's just that 3 weeks prior to that I really be careful not to feed them like that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for putting this together, Carolyn.
Sure, no problem.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Next month we will have Dr. Kelsey Bentley from Kansas State. She's going to show us so she's a new PhD at Kansas State, and she received her PhD at West Virginia, and she's going to highlight some of her research that she did there that kind of shows the correlation between resistance to parasites and immunology to other things. So really interesting research that she's done. So please join us next month. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Doctor.
Anytime.
Oh, that was great.